Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Jessica Jones Season 1. So in honor and in preparation of the upcoming release of The Defenders, I thought I'd cover a Marvel Netflix show that I haven't covered yet. I've already done detailed reviews for The Iron Fist and Luke Cage, as well as a series of reviews for Daredevil Season 2. But for Jessica Jones, the only thing I've done was one short spoiler-free video, so I thought I'd do a more in-depth review of Jessica Jones to get ready for The Defenders. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Jessica Jones up to the end of Season 1, so if you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. However, you can instead check out my quick review of Jessica Jones, which is spoiler-free. I'll put a link to that in the description below. So first of all, I have to be honest, after rewatching Jessica Jones, I actually liked it a lot more than I did when I initially saw it. Those of you who did see the quick review I did on the show might have noticed my review wasn't as glowing as most reviews were. Although I still liked the show, I seem to have more issues with it than most did. However, upon a rewatch, I actually found this show was really good up until the last 3 episodes, which is where I felt the story kind of dipped and got a little bit less interesting, leading to the big finale, which I found a bit lackluster, and I didn't feel it significantly paid off all the extensive buildup. However, that's actually a problem pretty much every Marvel Netflix show has, as it seems all of them go on for too long and then start to become tired or repetitive towards the end. This was very true of Daredevil Season 2 and Luke Cage Season 1, which I actually believe were a bit worse in that regard. So watching Jessica Jones again, I'd have to say this is one of my favorite seasons of a Netflix Marvel show thus far. Well, it's either this or Daredevil Season 1, which is my absolute favorite. Although I'd have to watch that one again to be sure which one I like better, because it's been so long since I've seen it. However, I will admit something that I haven't admitted yet, and that is Jessica Jones is the whole thing that attracted me to these Marvel Netflix shows in the first place. And had it not been for Jessica Jones, I'm not sure I'd watch it at all. I've heard of Daredevil when Jessica Jones first came out, and I heard it was a good show, but I had no real interest in watching it because thinking of Daredevil made me think of that crappy Ben Affleck film. However, what really attracted me to Jessica Jones was Krysten Ritter, who of course I knew as playing Jane on Season 2 of Breaking Bad, who was, in my opinion, one of the most interesting characters on the show. And the promos for Jessica Jones were making out that this character was basically Jane from Breaking Bad, but as a private detective with superpowers, and I was so into that. But I did decide if I was going to watch Jessica Jones, I should watch Daredevil first, and I was blown away by that show as well, which is far better than I thought it would be. So the thing I did like about Jessica Jones the most was, in fact, Jessica Jones. In fact, if I had a complaint about Jessica Jones, it would be that it didn't feature enough Jessica Jones. I love Krysten Ritter as a performer, and what she did in Jessica Jones was by far her best performance yet. It was a brilliant casting decision to cast her in this role, as she really perfectly defined it by playing the right mixture of someone who had suffered trauma and had an apathetic view towards other people, as she deals with mostly scumbags and people who are deceitful and mostly shitty to each other. However, at the same time, despite her rough and smart-ass exterior, is still someone who ultimately wants to help people, and there is this undercurrent of wanting to be a hero, and Krysten Ritter plays these different conflicts absolutely beautifully. You really identify with her and follow her on this journey. Now, the show is decidedly very dark, as not only does it focus on an unlikable antisocial smartass as the main protagonist, but also deals with the issue of rape, murder, and an antagonist that has the ability to force his will onto others. The show very effectively pulls off this dark tone, making it clear this isn't your typical comic book adaptation. Although it could be argued that Marvel Netflix shows in general have made a brand of having those features. However, I would argue that this is by far the darkest of all of the Marvel Netflix shows. And it begins very well with establishing Jessica Jones as a character and then setting up that she already has this history with the main antagonist, and then setting up a storyline with an innocent young girl who was used by the antagonist Kilgrave to kill her own parents. And I love how Jessica's initial reaction upon learning the man who ruined her life, who had basically raped her and far worse, whom she is still traumatized by, has returned, and her first reaction is to flee, to get the hell away. But then you see her softer side, the side that wants to help people, winning out, as she wants to help this young girl who suffered through similar abuse that she had. And this was a great driving force for the series that really added to her character and her noble intentions. I still will assert, though, that the show Jessica Jones may not be, while it may not be my favorite Marvel Netflix show, the character Jessica Jones is my favorite Marvel Netflix character, and is in fact the character I'm most excited to see return in the upcoming Defenders. In fact, I'm also delighted that the Defenders will be a shorter season, then perhaps it won't suffer the same issues as most of the other Netflix shows have. However, as I mentioned in my quick review, part of the issue I had with this show is that Jessica Jones' superpowers felt kind of tacked on and unnecessary to the overall plot. It's like the show was like, here's this smartass private investigator trying to defeat this guy with mind control powers. Oh yeah, and by the way, she has superpowers. You know, I know some people actually saw this as a positive, as the show focused more on her personal stories and her character rather than the fact that she has super strength. And I kind of like that too, but it seemed to me, why even bother giving her superpowers in the first place then? It seemed more like a gimmick to connect it to the greater Marvel universe rather than anything that actually contributes anything to the story. And also, I have to say, sometimes her superpowers kind of sucked. There were two specific examples when Jessica got her ass kicked far too easily, and it made it really hard for me to buy that she had superpowers at all. And ultimately, I would just say it was very contrived, bad writing, because it was obvious that for the purposes of the plot, they wanted her defeated, but really it made her look really weak. Because hell, I can think of some badass female characters from other shows and movies that don't even have superpowers that still could have kicked ass in these situations. And I'm speaking specifically about the scene where Jessica Jones ambushed Kilgrave and kidnapped him in a van. But this time, you know, this ton of paid bodyguards managed to show up and kick her ass and take Kilgrave back, and they seemed to win far too easily, and I was really bothered by this. But an even worse example was later in the series when those people who had the support group for being used by Kilgrave, they were led by that annoying neighbor sister. They were able to ambush her and kick her ass. That was way unbelievable. I don't care if you say she was caught off guard, if she was drunk, or she was already injured. There's no possible way these pansies could knock unconscious someone who has freaking superpowers. And for that matter, I found the show's attempt to connect to the greater MCU a bit weak and obvious, particularly with the woman who hired Jessica as an attempt to get back at her because she has superpowers and because she lost someone due to collateral damage in the Avengers movie, you know, the event or whatever the hell they call it. First of all, the Avengers saved New York from an alien invasion. Secondly, it's silly to say because she has superpowers, people would connect them all together. It gives the whole thing a much more X-Men type feel to it. In fact, the whole thing about them keep bringing up people who are gifted, it seems far more X-Men-y to me, and not like the rest of the Marvel Universe, which was never like that. And plus, the whole thing of the Avengers collateral damage was handled in, Marvel movies that came out after this show that handled it a lot better, so it didn't really need to be addressed here. So, let me get to the main villain of the series, Kilgrave, who was in fact a great villain, perhaps the best in the entire Marvel Expanded Universe, and he was played wonderfully by actor David Tennant, whom many recognize as one of the highlights of the show, and I totally agree with this. However, sometimes I felt they took the darkness of this character bit too far, as he would do super fucked up things, which I feel clashes with some of the show's lighter or more supernatural themes. I mean, the stuff he makes people do sometimes is generally just a bit too fucked up. But that being said, he did make a really great and possible villain to beat, and someone who desperately needed to be defeated. And his backstory of how he viewed himself as being abused as a child was in fact really interesting, and just added to him as a character and made him a bit more believable and not just someone who was evil for the sake of being evil. It was also a really nice twist that Jessica was now immune to his abilities, so he would have to get at her by hurting other people, which was a really sadistic indeed. And the way he had absolutely no regard for human life and felt that they were just there to serve his own needs was pulled off really effectively. Now, I had seen similar characters in the past, such as a little boy in the Twilight Zone movie who had special powers to create whatever he wanted, and he used his powers to control his parents and everyone around him in order to get exactly what he wanted. And then there's a character known as Pusher from a couple of episodes of The X-Files who was very similar. He tricked people into doing things by convincing, by just telling them that something was happening, like, you're seeing snakes, and he'd make them believe it so they would act however he wanted to act. And there's an episode of Fringe where there's this young kid who had the ability to force people to do whatever he wanted by telling them what to do, so pretty much just like Kilgrave. And I'm sure there are more examples of this from things I haven't seen, but the main point is, I think that Kilgrave was actually far better than any of those other villains. I think the way they pulled it off here was so much more disturbing. It was so much more intense. It was just such a despicable villain that you really wanted to see defeated, and also an impossible to defeat villain as well. Is portrayed as very powerful and very smart. So I felt the show did an amazing job of just showcasing how powerful and insidious these powers could be, as well as exploring the lasting effects they could have on his victims. However, that being said, I do think at times the show focused a little too much on him. At times it feels like the show should have been called Kilgrave instead of Jessica Jones. Even though Jessica was still getting more screen time than him, it seemed like all that screen time was spent talking about Kilgrave, to where her personal stories or super strength didn't really matter, and the focus was just entirely on him, and sometimes a bit too much. It makes me really wonder what a Jessica Jones show without Kilgrave will even look like. And as I said, I think his story went on for a bit too long. The whole storyline with him using the fetal tissue from his unborn child to ramp up his superpowers, and going to a concert hall to play concerts to control people, was a bit silly. And the way Jessica defeated him by pretending to be under his control when really she wasn't, I didn't really find that very satisfying, because it was a bit too obvious. I mean, even he saw through it at first, but then he was dumb enough to fall for it anyway. So there was also the character of Trish, Jessica's best friend, whom I loved. I thought she worked really well in this role, as we learned she was in fact Jessica's foster sister after her actual family died, and that her mother was horrible to them when they were younger. I think she works really well as a sidekick without powers of her own. She's probably one of my favorite sidekick in the Marvel Netflix universe. I love how she still managed to be useful and wasn't just a damsel in distress. She often had really great advice that put Jessica back on track just when she was about to waver. And she was also very different than Jessica. She was more of the upstanding citizen who was friendly and easier to be around, and yet her and Jessica got along so well. And the backstory we got of these two being foster sisters and learning to live with each other worked really well and added a lot to the relationship and made it really believable. So yeah, I thought her character added a lot to the show. And then there's the character of Officer Simpson, whose character started off really interesting as someone who was used by Kilgrave in an attempt to kill Trish, and Jessica managed to save his life when Kilgrave tried to have him kill himself. And then later he felt so guilty about what Kilgrave had tried to make him do that he went on this hunt with Jessica to kill Kilgrave. However, then all of a sudden they introduced this storyline of him having been a part of this elite special forces group that just came out of nowhere, which give him these like drugs that turn him to a super strength maniac who all of a sudden decides it's Jessica's fault that Kilgrave isn't dead, so he goes on this crazy rampage to kill her. This storyline came completely out of nowhere. It felt so contrived and ridiculous and just out of the blue. Now granted, apparently, this is actually some comic book character known as Nuke, so he was always introduced to be this comic book character, but still the way that this was handled in the show itself was so poorly executed. I do think this is definitely a low point of the show. The show also introduced us to the character of Hogarth, the rich, sharky lawyer played by Carrie-Anne Moss, who was also briefly in season 2 of Daredevil. This was also a very rich character who's obviously very swarmy, but she can be used to do the right thing because she's a great lawyer. But that being said, she has no real morals herself and puts her own self-interest ahead of everything else. So it made perfect sense when she helped Kilgrave escape so she could use him to force her wife to sign the divorce papers, and that of course ends up backfiring her in the worst possible way. So you do have to wonder if she will learn some lessons from that or continue being the despicable lawyer. So she was actually a beautifully flawed character that added a lot to the show. However, I did find the side plot with her trying to leave her wife a bit distracting and uninteresting, and I do think a bit more time than necessary was spent on that storyline. And speaking of side plots that were distracting and unnecessary, let me now get to Jessica's neighbors. I did find Malcolm's story at the start of the season interesting, as at first he just seemed like a typical, beyond hope junkie, until we learned it was Kilgrave that made him that way, which added a lot of flavor to his story and made it a lot more sort of interesting. But I think him becoming he was becoming very uninteresting and distracting in the later half of the season, and the brother and sister who argued a lot were never interesting and were always just a waste of time. I actually found it really disturbing how Kilgrave simply just killed the brother, and Jessica and Malcolm were just leading the sister along to make her think that he was still alive, because the thing is, they played these characters off as like special needs people, and then the show seemed to like mock them or expect us to find humor in their misery, and that just didn't sit right with me. And I also thought it was really dumb when the sister became, the cliche nonsensical voice to get Jessica, when it didn't really make any sense to do so. And it seemed obvious that the support group Malcolm put together for the victims of Kilgrave was meant to be an analogy of for like rape victims, and then the way that these victims were humiliated and portrayed as whiners and then ultimately used by Kilgrave where they almost all died, that really didn't sit right with me if the analogy is to be of victims of rape. So I found this part like really disturbing, not in a good way at all. It just didn't sit right with me. So this show gave us the introduction of Luke Cage, whom I wasn't impressed with at first, as when I first watched the show, I didn't realize this was a character from the comic books, nor did I know that he'd be getting his own show. And I didn't really buy his relationship with Jessica. They didn't really seem to have any chemistry to me. Although I did think the part where it was revealed that Jessica had killed his wife while under Kilgrave's control did add a nice bit of complex conflict into the series that made the relationship even more complicated. So overall, I thought he was fine in the show. I wasn't clamoring to see him on his own solo show, but he was fine. It was alright. So my rating for Jessica Jones Season 1 out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. Overall, I did find this a great show with really interesting characters, and it was at its best when it's focused on the title character, Jessica Jones, who was a fully well-rounded, complex, dynamic character, and the struggles she had to go through against a truly unstoppable foe was really suspenseful and engaging. but it did go on for a bit too long, where the ending seemed to drag, and it was brought down by a bit few of these unnecessary side plots. But all in all, one of the darker and more effective shows on Netflix, full stop. And seeing the great character of Jessica Jones again is the thing I'm most looking forward to in the upcoming Netflix show, The Defenders, so I just cannot wait for that. So that's it for my review of Jessica Jones. I will be doing a series of thoughts on video for each episode of The Defenders when they come out, where after I watch each episode, I'll make a video outlining my thoughts on each episode. They won't be like well edited or well structured, just be like just blabbering into a microphone. But be sure to keep an eye out for that. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek Dark Matter, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.